Okay, good evening. I'm Dave Roberts. Going to be discussing some birds from the Hawaiian Islands. This map shows the four main Hawaiian island groups, from Kauai at the northwest to the Big Island, or island of Hawaii, on the southeast. Um, First impression, when visitors arrive in Hawaii and go to their resorts, they see a number of very colorful birds, such as these. All of these you can see at most resorts, with the exception of the red-billed Leothrix at the bottom right. Um, However, none of these birds are native Hawaiian birds, and in fact, most visitors to the islands probably never see a native land bird from the Hawaiian Islands. Um, Looking at eBird recently, it now shows 283 species with eBird records for the Hawaiian Islands, and 262 of those since 2000. So you'll notice this is a lot less than most states on the mainland, and this is to be expected for an island, which has a lot more restricted environment. Of these 283, only 31 are endemic species. Um, in addition, there are indigenous seabirds and shorebirds, about 20 of them. Notably, visitors also find that there are no gulls on Hawaiian Islands. There's no appropriate area for them to nest there. So other than vagrants, you won't see gulls, but there are 5 species of terns that are indigenous to the islands. There also are migrants, regular migrants, ducks, shorebirds, and pelagics. But the largest numbers are the introduced species, which you saw some on the previous slide. These include a number of temperate passerines that have been introduced to the islands, as well as game birds, and we'll look at some of those a little later. And the other large number of birds are vagrants that visit the islands. So these are all seabirds and other migrant ducks and geese that occasionally visit the island. So to understand the current birds that are native to the island, it's important to understand the geography and history of the Hawaiian Islands. So the state of Hawaii consists of the 4 windward islands at the end of a long chain of Pacific islands that extends all the way out to Midway, about 1,000 miles to the northwest. These islands are in this pattern because the Pacific Ocean plate is drifting slowly to the northwest. And over the past 50 million years, that plume began up at Midway. And as it drifts over a magma plume that underlies this plate, each of these volcanic islands have been formed. So this chain of islands has existed for about 50 million years, and birds have become established over that time. However, the main islands that we can visit now and that are occupied are much younger than that. So Kauai at the northwest is about 5 million years old, Oahu about 3, Molokai and Maui about 1.3 million, and the Big Island of Hawaii started forming about 400,000 years ago. And it's listed as 0 to 400,000 because it's still volcanically active, and many acres of land are added to the southeast part of the island every year from the continuing lava flows. So although birds have been occupying this island chain for millions of years, humans have not. The first Polynesian settlements on the islands are estimated to have begun around 940 Common Era to 1100. The first Europeans showed up in the 1500s. First, there were some Spanish explorers who didn't stay, and then permanent settlements began with the arrival of James Cook. In 1815, Hawaii became a Russian protectorate, and then eventually reverted back to US territory in 1898. And commercial development by the Europeans on Hawaii was really launched in the 1830s with the establishment of the first successful sugarcane plantations. And as we'll see, the sugarcane really has transformed the islands. It became an official US territory in 1898 and a state in 1959. Unfortunately, many of the endemic birds on the islands succumbed to the arrival of humans. There have been close to 80 extinctions recorded on the islands over the last 700 years. And as I learned from this book that was introduced to me by my guide on the recent trip to Oahu, Hawaii leads all islands in the number of extinctions that have been recorded, much more than New Zealand even, or other islands in the Pacific, and many more extinctions than have been recorded in the same period on the continental US. Looking at these across the four main islands, the color code here, the lime color at the top are extant birds that are still viable of the endemics. Endangered species are listed in red, and all the remaining are ones that became extinct either historically since the arrival of Europeans in gray, or since the arrival of the Polynesians in yellow. So you can see that there are only a minority of endemic species that remain on the islands today, and the percentage that have remained are higher on the island of Hawaii and on Kauai. I'm not going to dwell on all the species that are gone, but I thought this from the book I just showed is interesting. When the Polynesians arrived, there were 7 species of geese that were endemic to the islands. Obviously, the bigger ones made a better meal, so 6 of those 7 have become extinct, and only the nene, which is the smallest goose on the right, didn't make a big enough meal and survived till today, although it is also critically endangered. I found this duck interesting from the historic record. It looks kind of like a kiwi with like a platypus bill. It's the Kauai mole duck. And it shows that the type of extreme adaptation that can occur when species are isolated on an island or chain of islands for such a long period of time. Hawaii at one time also had an eagle. This is close in its DNA sequence to the white-tailed eagles that you find in Asia and some parts of Europe. It existed on several islands, but is now extinct, and only subfossil remains are around to show evidence that it existed. On islands, you also see extreme differentiation of species. In the case of the scimitar nukupu'u, for specialization of diets. The most recent extinction, which occurred since the first time I visited the islands, is the po'uhi, which wasn't recognized until 1973 when they discovered it in the remote slopes of Haleakala, which is the major volcano on Maui. It subsisted on native land snails, its major food source, but even when they discovered this population, they realized that it was threatened by feral pigs. In 1980, a census estimated that there was a population of 140 on Maui, but they rapidly collapsed so that there were only 10 remaining by 1990. At that time, they tried to protect them by fencing to exclude the feral pigs, but their numbers continued to decline until there were only 3 left, 1 male and 2 females. They tried to relocate a female to the male's territory, which failed, and the last male died in captivity in 2004. So enough of birds that are not there. This is a list of the remaining species. And again, you can see that a majority of the endemic land birds are endangered, some of them critically, and the alela, the second from the top, is the Hawaiian crow, was extirpated in the wild, but has been bred recently in captivity. And recently, a few of them have been released back into the wild to try to reestablish them. So the reason that these remain critically endangered is that there are a number of threats that limit the survival of these endemic birds. These include the introduction of avian malaria, which currently limits the range of most of these species to above 4,000 feet elevation. There also are issues with feral sheep, goats, and pigs that destroy habitat. The sugarcane plantations introduced mongoose to control rodents, especially rats, in the field, but the mongoose also likes bird eggs and is also a significant threat to limit the survival of endemics at low elevation. Some of the introduced birds, specifically the warbling white-eye, have also adapted to high elevation where the remaining endemics can survive and are competing with them for food. And finally, the most recent and perhaps a critical threat is the emergence of a disease of the ohia lahua. It's called rapid ohia die-off, or ROD. And at the bottom right, you see an apapane feeding on the flowers of the ohia. And this is its obligate food source. So this die-off has resulted in loss of tens of thousands of acres of ohia. Fortunately, at high elevation, they're still surviving, and so that's an ongoing critical threat to these endemics. So I will go through each of the islands from oldest to newest and begin with Kauai. Kauai is what remains of Waialeale volcano. It now has a fairly flat plateau from what remains of the summit of that volcano. And the whole central part of this island is very remote, and it's largely inaccessible because it also gets a tremendous amount of rainfall. And the summit of Waialeale is the world's wettest spot with over 700 inches of rain a year. So the accessible areas of the island are mostly the perimeter at the shore, but I'll be first discussing the Koki State Park, which is at the end of this road that goes up to 4,000 feet. And from there is access to the Alakai Swamp. It's the home of most of the highly endangered species in this area. So I'm going to spend a little time on this western area that you can access through Koki State Park, and then we'll go to Kilauea Lighthouse on the east. So in Koki Park and in Alakai Swamp, it's common to see this Kauai endemic, the Kauai elapaio. You'll be seeing elapaios on each of the islands, and these have differentiated into several different species. So the Kauai elapaio is a specific species. They're similar, but you'll see that this one is much lighter than the elapaio we'll be seeing on the other islands. It's a very curious bird, and I think if Linda was living there and has here the Carolina wren invading her house, this is the most likely endemic to come into your living environment. It's very curious about humans, and you can often see it at eye level, and it will often follow hikers through the jungle. The next is the Kauai amakihi. Its name resembles one of its calls, which I think is typical around the world. And this is an honeycreeper family. They all have these curved bills, and they are a canopy birds, so it's not common to get them down to eye level. Next, we have the Apapane. This is not differentiated between the different islands. So Apapane is the same everywhere, same species. We'll be seeing more of them. They're also a canopy bird. And I thought I had a picture of the Kauai Iwi, but unfortunately the best I have is a blurry, hardly even an ID shot. So I'll be showing you much better pictures of Iwis later, but this is an example of the effects of the avian malaria. If you go back to 1800, shown on the map at the top, the light green area was the range of this bird on each of the islands, and they ranged from sea level up to the tree line. Now in Kauai, they're restricted to this tiny area, which is in the Alakai swamp and very difficult to get to. And as you can see on the chart on the right, if it's not obscured by the thumbnail. So since 1980, the number of EEVs has continued to decline and now is at less than 1 bird per hectare. So whether I'm ever going to get a better picture of them on this island is unclear. I also have one ID shot of a KKA, which is this endemic bird. And as you can see, since I'm just showing a drawing, this is a very rare bird in the Alakai swamp. And I managed to get on it with the help of a native who I happened to run into in the swamp. In addition to these passerines, there are several other interesting endemics in Kauai. One is the koloa, which is the Hawaiian duck, which looks similar to a mallard, but not quite. And in fact, it has hybridized with mallards on most of the other islands, but Kauai is the one island where you can still find purebred koloa that are accepted by eBird reviewers. Here's the nene, which is the Hawaiian goose. These are present on Kauai as well as the Big Island. They have been bred in captivity to maintain numbers, but on Kauai, they also are breeding in the wild. And the Hawaiian coot is shown on the right. This is similar to our American coot, except that it has a much bigger mantle on its head. And the pueo is the short-eared owl. This is a subspecies of the same short-eared owl that we see here on the mainland. And it's differentiated only at the subspecies level. And the one interesting thing about it on Kauai is that it tends to hunt in the daytime. And I've several times seen them hovering. They like to hover and sort of survey the area below that they're thinking to find prey. So now moving to the North Shore, and the Kilauea Lighthouse and the National Wildlife Refuge that surrounds it is one of my favorite places on this island. And it's a great place to spend hours or even days watching all of the pelagics that come by. And so there are a number of striking birds that you can see from this point. There are 2 tropic birds. The one on the left is the white-tailed tropic bird, which is present year-round on the islands. The red-tailed tropic bird commutes from South America. So if you come in the winter, you're unlikely to see it, but in spring or summer, they become quite common here at the point. The white-tailed tropic bird can be seen on the shore, but also cruises in the canyons, especially Waimea Canyon in the center of the island. So you can see them away from the shore. There are 2 main boobies, the brown booby, which sometimes appears here in Maryland, and the red-footed, which doesn't. The red-footed boobies nest on the cliffs next to Kilauea Point, And you can see thousands of them nesting there. Every morning they leave to go feed, and at the end of the day they come back. And when they come back to feed their brood, they often encounter this other seabird, the great frigate bird, which the Hawaiian word for it is iwa, which translates literally to thief. And the males have this red pouch, which they can inflate, and the females have the white. And when the red footed boobies come back to feed their families, they are accosted by the waiting frigate birds who try to steal their fish and sometimes succeed. The brown boobies also are somewhat parasitic in attacking the red-footed boobies. So it's not easy to be a red-footed booby, but they do succeed because there's so many of them there. For albatrosses, the most famous is the Laysan albatross, and you may have heard about one of the Hawaiian albatrosses that at, I think it was 67 this last year, 67 years of age, had a successful hatchling. And she seems to still be going strong, and she's mapped hundreds of thousands of miles of flight. They've been tracking her over her lifetime. So the Laysan albatross have an enormous wingspan, and they are a majestic bird. You see these easily at the Kilauea Lighthouse. On rare occasions, you can also see black-footed albatross, two examples of those here, which nest not on the islands, but on the far northwest shoals. One of the main nesting birds on Kauai and at the Kilauea Point is the wedge-tailed shearwater. These appear by the thousands in the spring. And if you visit in May, they're in the process of nesting. And if you look carefully, you can see them in their underground nests that they excavate out of the cliffs at Kilauea Point. The picture on the right is one sitting on her eggs and waiting for the male to come back at the end of the day. And around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, you start to hear this moaning sound coming from all around the lighthouse. And that's the females calling for their mate, who is due to bring back takeout dinner. Kilauea Point is also a good place for vagrants. I don't guarantee anybody will see these, but I think one of the most interesting ones I encountered was a Kermadec petrel, which is a bird that spends most of its time down around New Zealand, and decided to come up and visit the Hawaiian Islands. And one winter when I was there, in addition to the nene goose, there was also a snow goose that had decided to visit from the tundra, and decided that this is a good place for a winter vacation. Moving on to Oahu, as Scott said, my last visit there, I got the endemics. It's a quick list, but to see these, you have to hire a guide, and you have to go into some closed native lands because there's very little at high enough elevation for these to exist. This is the Oahu alapaio. You can see it has a much darker coloration than the Kauai one. This is the Oahu amakihi and the apapane, which is an ordinary apapane. Also of interest on Oahu, and for this you can just go to Waikiki and hang out with the tourists, is the manukuko, which is the white tern. White tern ranges over other islands also in the Pacific, but it's indigenous to Oahu, and it nests on Diamond Head area near Waikiki. But they also set up nests in town, and in the small urban parks, you can often see them perched. there are two interesting indigenous species, the Hawaiian black-necked stilt, which is a subspecies of the black-necked stilt that we're familiar with here on the mainland. My guide that got me to on the endemics at high elevation also knew where to find some Hawaii, the yellow-faced grassquit, which is an introduced species, very hard to find, but with guide you can do it. And in the urban parks, you can see these bulbils, either the red-whiskered bulbils or the red-vented bulbils, which are introduced species that are unique to Oahu, not the other islands. Moving on to Maui. Maui again has the Apapane. They have the Maui amakihi, which is again a unique species. The Aloahio, which is the Maui creeper. And all of these you can see at Hosmer Grove, which is high on the flanks of Haleakala, which is the main volcano on that island. And here the iiwi is feeding on its favorite flower, which is a member of the legume family. Which leaves us then with the Big Island. And the appeal of the Big Island is in part that it has so many different climates. And these range from arid desert to Arctic tundra. This variety is partially by the size of the volcanoes. The northern volcano is Mauna Kea, and the southern is Mauna Loa. These are both above 13,000 feet. And if you visit the island in winter, you can often see this type of scenery from the sea level. And this is the picture in the top right, is the summit of Mauna Kea, where all of the observatories are. And as you can see, it gets quite a good snowcap in a good winter. So this is a three-dimensional map of the islands. Mauna Kea is a dormant volcano, which is why they can have observatories on it, and probably will not erupt anymore. Mauna Loa has been erupting continuously and has continuous lava flows that are building new real estate. So on the Big Island, this is my most recent endemic that I've added to my list, and one of the hardest ones to get. It's again in a closed land that you need permits to access and guide. So the Palila is a type of finch, which is endemic. There are finches that are endemic to several of the islands, but they are extremely rare. The Palila historical range encompassed a lot of high elevation across two of the volcanoes, but its current range is restricted to the yellow zone. And by the last census, there's somewhere between 200 and 300 of these birds left. And they are struggling to survive, in part because feral sheep grazing at high elevations are destroying their habitat. And this area that they are in currently is mostly fenced off, and it requires constant surveillance to keep feral sheep from causing further damage in this area. On the other side of Mauna Kea, there's a small gray area shown in the top right. Hopefully that's not obscured for you with thumbnails like it is for me. That's on the windward flank of Mauna Kea. And there's, again, a closed area, and they have very limited numbers of permits. You have to have a guide, and each guide has a fixed number of permits that they can use in a year. So it's very difficult to get into these areas. But the Akepa is another member of the honey creeper family, and exists only at high elevation on this part of the flanks of Mauna Kea. The same area is the territory for the Hawaii creeper, which is the cousin of the Maui creeper. And again, it is very rare and critically endangered, but also a very beautiful bird. A little easier to find, although it's easier to hear, not easy to see, is the endemic thrush of the Hawaiian Islands. And this is the Oma'o, and it can be found on the Big Island. It exists at a somewhat broader range and is a typical thrush in its behavior. Has beautiful song, quite shy, doesn't like to be seen, but if you follow its call and can make it through whatever foliage it's hiding in, it can be found. The amakihi is generally easier to find and is possible to see in Volcano National Park and at elevations higher than that. The male on the right is a much brighter yellow color, and the female is on the left. And this is the EEV again. The EEV is on the Big Island, easiest to find above 6,000 feet. So it requires some hiking up the flanks of Mauna Loa to find its territories, but it can be worth the effort. It's really a beautiful bird and quite active. So these are pictures of the Hawaii Elepaio. And this, I think, is in the process of differentiating into two different species, or at least a subspecies. The lighter ones on the right are found in drier areas on the flanks of Mauna Kea, and the darker ones with the more bold markings are found in the forested areas. The Elepaio seems to be somewhat resistant to the malaria because it can be found down to around 3,000 feet. And these are apapanis from the Big Island, quite active birds. And if you want to encounter them intimately, I'd recommend staying in Volcano Village. There's some bed and breakfast there. And you can wake up in the morning with these birds singing outside, and they're quite entertaining to watch. Big Island has two birds of prey. One is the pueo, the short-eared owl again, and the io, which is the Hawaiian hawk, which is critically endangered. And Hawaiian hawk comes in both a dark morph and a light morph, shown in pictures here. Likes to soar over the canyons near the coast and also somewhat inland. There are several indigenous wetland birds. The akuku is the Hawaiian name for black-crowned night heron. This is the same species of night heron that exists, I think, in every continent. The aleula is the common moorhen, and this is a subspecies of the common moorhen found in Eurasia. There's a small population of established pied-billed grebe on the Big Island, not on any of the others, and also small populations established recently of white-faced ibis, and again, the Hawaiian black-necked stilt subspecies. Turning to the terns, there are several noddies. I've been lucky in getting pictures of black noddies, not so far from brown noddies. They've eluded me. And I have one picture in the lower right of a blue-gray noddy following a black noddy. The blue-gray noddy doesn't nest on the islands. It nests out in the, again, on some of the shoals. But both black and brown noddies are nesting on volcanic cliffs on the Big Island. This is the star of migrant shorebirds, and people can make birders can make a lot of effort to find these in Alaska, trekking out to very remote locations, or you can just go to Hawaii in the winter, and the Kioea or bristle-thighed curlew, migrates from Alaska and tundra to both to the Big Island in very remote places and easier to find on Oahu, where it likes the golf courses. So it's quite easy to find on Oahu. There also are some more common migrants. We have ruddy turnstones and sanderlings, the wandering tattler, and huge numbers of Pacific golden plover, also known as the kolea. This is the one migrant that tourists are very likely to see because kolea are everywhere. In town, on golf courses, in parks, on the beaches, they're everywhere. There are also several annual migrants. The northern pintail, I guess, and the northern shoveler are the most frequent because they have Hawaiian names. But you also see a variety of others that are fairly regular visitors, including scaup and both American and Eurasian widgeons. And then turning finally to the vagrants, the most common gull that visits is the laughing gull, although it's very hard in my case to find them, but I finally got one on a fish pond on the Big Island. Bonaparte's gulls also show up occasionally, and a variety of other species that are really quite rare. I was surprised in a recent visit to the Big Island, in addition to all the kolea, there was also a black-bellied plover. This was on the rare birds list, and top right is a black tern. Brant, I've seen several years. This is a specific brant that they wander, and one of the places they wander to is to the Hawaiian Islands, and greater and lesser yellowlegs, and also redshanks can appear occasionally as rarities. So rebirding, I showed you on the first slide some pictures of some of the common tropical birds. After the Europeans arrived and realized that the Hawaiians had eaten all of their game birds, they decided to reintroduce some so that they could hunt. And there are three main species of francolins that have been introduced, all from different locations, two from India, one from Africa. California quails were introduced about 150 years ago from the West Coast. And the Kalish pheasant from Southeast Asia was introduced. So some of these are open country birds, the quail and the black francolin and the urkels. The gray francolin is more in wooded areas, and the Kalish pheasant is mostly in rainforest at high elevations. There are also some interesting open country birds. The red abatabat was introduced in 1900 from Southeast Asia. It took me a long time to get on these because they are very social, but locations where they're seen, they're either there or not, and they tend to be like pine siskins. They flock in, make a lot of activity, and then leave. And so if you're not there at the right time, they're easy to miss. Eurasian skylarks were introduced from England in 1865 and have become established in some of the more exposed open country areas, and Western meadowlarks also too from the US, and African silverbills from Africa. In terms of forest birds, they've been introduced from every continent again. And we have waxbills, Java sparrows. Right-rumped shama is most common on Kauai. It can be seen occasionally on some of the other islands. The warbling white-eye is the one I mentioned, which is problematic for the endemics because it seems to be able to range almost up to the tree line at high elevation, and it also likes the ohia trees, so it's competing with the endemics for food. Red-billed leothrix from China is a fairly reclusive bird, but if you can get on it, they're quite striking. And the Japanese bush warbler is another one that's easy to hear and very, very difficult to get your eyes on. There are several doves that have been introduced onto the islands. The ones that are best established are the spotted dove and the zebra dove. So these are the ones that you see commonly in urban areas and also outside of the towns. There are some rock doves that have become established, and there's an albino group that are very interesting to watch. Mourning dove is very difficult to find on the islands. They were introduced more recently, and they're an example of that not everything that you try to introduce in Hawaii likes it there. The mourning dove on the Big Island exists in open country and is really never found in town or around people. So it has different habits there than on the mainland. And the other cousin of the doves, which is an interesting find, is the chestnut-bellied sandgrouse, which was introduced from India. This is generally a desert bird, and they nest in very exposed places out in arid areas on the western part of the Big Island. And they like to be a few miles from one of the bedroom communities there that is home for a lot of the natives, and then come in to get water like they do from deserts in the Kalahari and also in India. There are also some exotics that have become established. All of these, except the rose-ringed parakeet, are on the Big Island. They're quite controversial. People tend to release their pets, and on Hawaii, that can mean that you're establishing a new species, which may or may not fit in with the environment that it's in. But there are populations of these that have become established. There also are cockatoos on Oahu and some other exotic parrots there. So that's the end of my pictures. What I want to leave people with is some information. If I've sparked your interest in visiting the Hawaiian Islands, they just lifted their absolute quarantine requirement. It used to be, up until now, it was 14 days before you could step foot outside of a hotel. Now, if you're pre-tested, you can visit. And so I want to mention in terms of getting into the areas where these rare endemics are, on the Big Island and on Oahu, I've used the Hawaii Forest and Trail Company, and I listed their website, and Gary Dean is really a remarkable guide. I've used him on the Big Island. On the Big Island also, there is a freelance guide. Lance Tolino is one of the top eBirders on the Hawaiian Islands, and he is also regional reviewer. So if you find any rarities, he's the person that has to approve them on the Hawaiian Islands. He runs his own bird guide company, and I put his website there. In the Alakai Swamp, I've met David Kuhn before. I haven't used him as a guide, but his thing is recording sounds of these rare endemics, and I put a URL for his website. Another person who leads groups into the Alakai Swamp is Jim Denny. I haven't met, but he seems to have a good reputation. In terms of bird guides, the Hawaiian Audubon Society has their Birds of Hawaii. It's currently now in its 6th edition, and picture of it's on the right. And I've also found useful this book, which lists a lot of instructions for how to get to a lot of the unusual hotspots on the islands. And if you can't go there in person, the Hawaii Festival, they have a bird fest. It's coming up. The URL is here, and they're offering a virtual tour of birding sites on Hawaii. So if you can't go there and are not up for trekking through the Alakai Swamp and not getting too muddy, this is maybe a way that you can visit. in the age of COVID and pandemics. So with that, I will stop. Hopefully I didn't go too long.
Well, that was great, Dave. Thank
Fantastic.
you. There's applause for me. Maybe if anybody has anything they want to ask out loud, or they can add them to the chat so it'll be more organized. You can do that.
Okay,
Let's see, where's the chat? Here I have it.
I thought I just had the chat, but
yes.
No. Oh, yes, I see.
It's on the right.
Okay, so Mike Bowen was asking for recommendations on field guides. I hopefully answered that for you.
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely.
Definitely the Audubon guide, and I'm sure there are other more recent books than the one I showed in terms of how to get hotspots. If you go on the usual lists of lists for local birding groups, there's an active group on Hawaii that reports where rarities are being seen and anything unusual that is worth seeing. And also, as I mentioned, the specific guides that you can hire who are all very dedicated to conservation of birds. And Gail comments on honey creepers now being considered a branch of finches.
Yeah, Drepanidae, when we went there, they were considered Drepanidae, but now they've changed. We went out with Jack Jeffrey, who was manager of Hakalau at that time, but we didn't go to Hakalau. We went to Kapuka out in the middle of the lava flow.
Mm-hmm.
But he did have a couple of comments, which I think people might like to hear. He, as I said, was managing this refuge, and he said that his job, he felt, was like presiding at a funeral. And and the other thing is he spent a lot of time looking for this was in 1994. So as you can see, a long time ago, and some of the species which are now considered extinct, like the ohu, had still been seen within the last 4 or 5 years. And so we actually went out with him looking for one in a restricted area and didn't see it. And he said he spent a lot of time looking for ghosts.
Yes, and I showed the 6th edition of the Hawaiian Audubon Bird Guide. I think mine is maybe the 2nd or 3rd edition, and it also contains a number of species that no longer exist. And even then, as you mentioned, those are ones that there were historical records of, and sometimes even an eBird historical record. But the extinctions continue, and it's a struggle.
Any question?
Okay, so Mike, another about, I think also the individuals to take for visiting birder. We have a recommendation from Richard Rowland for Alex Wong, endangered forest bird supervisor, and he gives phone number and email address. That's good to know. And let's see, more guides. And we have 2 recommendations for both Denny and Con. Those are the guides for the Alakai Swamp.
I have a couple of questions, if I may now. I have one kind of trivial one, but always interesting before you go. So you try to go somewhere first. What about insects in Hawaii, and especially the biting kind?
There are some mosquitoes, and there's some bad amoeboid parasites in some water, so you want to be careful what water you put yourself in. But mosquitoes are not too bad.
But okay, more interesting question, perhaps. What is the reason why there's been so much more, the extinction has been so much more thorough in Hawaii than any other extinction, as one of your first slides showed? Is it because of the isolation, the distance even between the islands? Is it understood?
Well, I think it's partially that they started with so many endemic species. So I think there's more diversity there because this chain of islands had been building over millions, tens of millions of years. And so looking at all the vagrants that appear, almost anything can appear on the island. Last time I was on the Big Island, I came across a belted kingfisher. And I have no idea how a belted kingfisher got there, but it did. And if in chance there were two belted kingfishers that were opposite sex, there could be endemic belted kingfishers established there. So I think over millennia, there have been probably a number of species that have appeared and disappeared. So extinctions have probably been ongoing even in the absence of humans, but it's that they evolved over tens of millions of years, and then humans showed up in the last 1,000 years, did a lot of slash and burn agriculture in the case of the Polynesians. And then when the Europeans came and decided that this was good for growing sugarcane, it really devastated the environment. And the other thing that's been pointed out to me is that if you look at the Big Island now, the saddle area between the two big volcanoes and the area west of that going down to the coast is now mostly scrubland or desert. And if you go back several hundred years, it was entirely forested in that area. So it's become much more arid because of deforestation. And so it was sugarcane, pineapple farming. And on the Big Island, the King Ranch owns a huge portion of mid-elevation land on the Big Island. And around Waimea, they are a huge cattle ranch.
Is there a let's say a general commitment to protecting what's remaining and continuing to rebird or to protect, or is it only a subpopulation of people, birders, etc.?
Well, there are academics, there are people like Gary Dean who does guiding, and Lance Nino, they also are very involved in the conservation of the birds. So it's a small number of academics and private citizens that are dedicated, and it's a constant battle. I mean, when you have the feral sheep and goats and pigs, especially pigs, because they're so intelligent, and almost any effort to fence in an area to fence out pigs, they'll find some way around. And I think that was the problem on Maui.
Wow.
So there's constant hunting of these feral animals. And when I've been trekking in very remote parts of the Alakai Swamp, I often come across hunters that are out hunting the pigs. They have to hunt for them at night because other than that, you're never going to get anywhere close to a pig.
Dave, one thing I find interesting is we do a lot of visiting of islands out in the Pacific and so forth. And the one thing about Hawaii is the birds seem so vulnerable to avian malaria, whereas avian malaria also exists on some of these other islands, like, the Society Islands, Tahiti, and so forth. And yet the native birds are in the lowlands as well. They just aren't as affected by it.
Yeah,
Population may have something to do with that. Yeah.
Right, and it's encouraging at least that the Ilapaio seems to be somewhat resistant. Whether resistance could be bred into the others, it's just because the populations are so small. It's a battle of time whether you can keep them going long enough to acquire resistance.
More questions? If not, thank you very much, Dave. This was great. And, you know, we know where to find you.
Okay, yeah, if anyone needs the URLs or anything, I can
Great.
separate that as a slide, and if you want to post that on the,
Yeah, I
slide
took
on
a
the-
screenshot of that slide.
okay,
And
so you can post it on.
Yeah, I've been recording, but unfortunately I did not start at the very beginning. So apologies, but so you'll have to give this again for the first part. Okay, so thank you very much. Or we can perhaps do the reactions. What I don't know how many we can get. Yeah, pretty good. Okay, excellent. So I think that's it for tonight, and we'll see you all next month, if not in between. And I'm glad that we had a great meeting after a slightly shaky start with the links, but let's forget about that. It will be better next time. Okay, so good night, everyone. I'm going to shut this down.
Thanks, everyone.
Right.
Thanks again. Okay. Okay, and okay, I see more people.